Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history in California. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. In the summer of 1865, the town of Placerville, California, once known by the grim moniker Hangtown, had begun to shed its violent reputation. The gold rush that had transformed the Sierra Nevada foothills a decade earlier was waning, but prosperity still clung to certain corners of El Dorado County. Among those who had found success was Thomas Caldwell, a 42-year-old prospector who, unlike most of his contemporaries, maintained a peculiar solitude despite his apparent fortune. What makes Caldwell's case particularly unsettling isn't what was found in his claim near the American River, but rather what was discovered beneath the floorboards of his cabin some 30 miles east of Sacramento. The discovery wasn't made until 1964, nearly a century after Caldwell's disappearance, when land surveyors preparing for a highway expansion project began examining abandoned properties in the area. According to county records obtained from the El Dorado Historical Society archives, what they found contradicted everything the locals had believed about the quiet miner who had vanished without a trace. Thomas Caldwell arrived in California in 1855, according to passenger manifests from ships arriving in San Francisco. Unlike the wave of 49ers who had come seeking instant wealth, Caldwell's arrival was more calculated. He purchased land and equipment methodically, paying in gold coin that several merchants noted in their ledgers was unusually pure. Bank records show he made regular deposits, but lived modestly in a single-room cabin that he constructed himself on a hillside overlooking a small tributary of the American River. The arrival records from San Francisco Harbor documented Caldwell as having embarked from Boston, though subsequent investigations would find no record of him in Massachusetts or any surrounding states. The ship's manifest listed his profession as accountant, not miner, suggesting he had reinvented himself upon reaching California. Captain William Thorne, who commanded the vessel, made a curious note in his personal log about a passenger fitting Caldwell's description. Among the passengers, a solitary man who speaks rarely but observes constantly, keeps to his cabin except at unusual hours. The steward reports he makes notes in a journal throughout the night, seems educated, but unwilling to engage in the camaraderie typical of ocean passage. Caldwell's first documented transaction in California was the purchase of a map of the mining regions from a shop in San Francisco. The shopkeeper, Emmanuel Rodriguez, later recalled to a newspaper reporter in 1859 that Caldwell had been uncommonly precise in his questioning about specific regions, particularly the less populated areas between Placerville and the higher elevations of the Sierra Nevada. Rodriguez was quoted as saying, "Most men who came through wanted to know where the strikes were happening. This fellow wanted to know where they weren't, where a man might work undisturbed." Upon reaching Placerville, then still commonly called Hangtown due to its frontier justice practices, Caldwell took lodging at the Carey House, a respectable establishment catering to the more successful prospectors and businessmen. Hotel registers show he stayed for precisely 3 weeks before disappearing from town without checking out. His bill was settled in full 2 days later when he returned briefly to collect his few possessions. The hotel manager noted that Caldwell had acquired surveying equipment and supplies sufficient for extended isolation. The cabin itself was unremarkable from the outside, a standard miner's dwelling with a stone chimney and a small covered porch. What differentiated Caldwell from his neighbors was his complete lack of social engagement. In a time when mining communities depended on mutual aid and camaraderie, Caldwell was described in multiple accounts as keeping entirely to himself. A letter from Jacob Perkins, the local general store owner, to his brother in Boston, dated October 1859, noted, "The peculiar miner Caldwell came for his monthly supplies yesterday. As always, he spoke not a word beyond what was necessary for commerce, though he pays fairly and promptly. The other men avoid him now, saying there's something in his eyes that doesn't sit right. The location Caldwell selected for his homestead proved telling in retrospect. Unlike most miners who established claims as close as possible to known gold-bearing streams, Caldwell built his cabin nearly a quarter-mile up a steep hillside, away from the water where he supposedly conducted his mining activities. The site commanded a clear view of the main trail connecting Placerville to the higher mining camps, allowing him to observe travelers in both directions. County land records indicate he purchased the parcel outright, rather than simply staking a claim, an unusual move that ensured his legal right to restrict access to the property. During his first 2 years in the area, Caldwell established a superficially normal routine. He worked a small claim along the tributary below his cabin, occasionally bringing modest amounts of gold dust and nuggets to the assayer's office in Placerville. Sampson Williams, who operated the assay office from 1854 to 1861, kept meticulous records of all transactions. His ledgers show that Caldwell's submissions were consistent but never remarkable, just enough to justify his presence as a miner, but not enough to attract attention or partnership offers from others. The quality of Caldwell's gold, however, differed from that found by other miners working the same watershed. Williams noted in his technical records that Caldwell's gold contained mineral traces more consistent with deposits found considerably higher in the mountains. When questioned about this discrepancy, Caldwell reportedly explained that he had found a unique geological formation that he was reluctant to discuss. No further questions were asked, as the independent nature of prospectors was generally respected in the mining communities. For nearly 10 years, Caldwell maintained this pattern. Monthly visits to town for supplies, regular bank deposits, and absolute solitude. No visitors were ever recorded coming to his property. No partnerships were formed. No claims were filed against him. In a frontier society built on interaction, Caldwell created a vacuum around himself that seemed impenetrable. What few realized was that Caldwell's isolation was actively maintained through subtle intimidation. When mining operations began to expand near his property in 1857, Caldwell approached the newcomers with what one survivor later described as cold courtesy, masking unmistakable menace. According to a deposition given in 1867 by miner Jeremiah Foster, Caldwell visited the camp established within a mile of his cabin and informed the men that he had placed strategic charges of black powder throughout the surrounding hillside. He told us, calm as could be, that he valued his privacy and had taken measures to preserve it. Said, we'd be wise to stay below the ridgeline. Showed us a diagram of where he'd set his charges. We laughed it off at first, thought he was bluffing. Next morning, we heard an explosion from the north slope, a warning shot, you might say. We moved camp that afternoon. Caldwell's technical knowledge extended beyond mining. A receipt found among land office papers indicates he ordered specialized books on chemistry and anatomy from a bookseller in Sacramento in 1858. The order included texts on the preservation of biological specimens and metallurgical assaying techniques, knowledge that would later prove significant to investigators piecing together his activities. The delivery of these materials was arranged through an intermediary, a teamster named Samuel Klein, who transported goods between Sacramento and Placerville. Klein's logbook contains a cryptic entry following the delivery. Took books to sea at Trail Junction as instructed. Man watched from trees, approached only after I left package under marked pine, never showed his face. Don't like this arrangement. The first unusual occurrence came in the spring of 1863, when Caldwell purchased an unusually large amount of quicksilver used in gold extraction, and several new shovels from Perkins's General Store. The transaction was noted because the quantity far exceeded what a single miner would typically use. When questioned by Perkins, Caldwell reportedly stated that he had found a new vein that required extensive work. No such claim was ever registered with the county assessor. The Quicksilver purchase coincided with reports of several travelers gone missing along the mountain routes that spring. A group of 3 men who had set out from Placerville toward the higher mining camps in March 1863 never reached their destination. A search party organized by associates found no trace along the main trail and eventually concluded the men had either abandoned their journey or fallen victim to exposure or animal attack, both common hazards in the still largely untamed Sierra foothills. Later that same year, travelers on the road near Caldwell's property reported hearing the sounds of digging well into the night and seeing lantern light moving about the property at unusual hours. Marshal James Hooker rode out to investigate after receiving complaints about the nocturnal activity, but according to his report, found Caldwell engaged in nothing more suspicious than expanding his root cellar for the coming winter. The marshal noted that Caldwell seemed unusually agitated by the inquiry and stood in such a way as to block view of the cabin's interior. Following Hooker's visit, Caldwell further isolated himself by constructing a crude fence around the immediate vicinity of his cabin. Joseph Miller, a hunter who occasionally passed through the area tracking deer, described the barrier in a conversation recorded by the proprietor of a Placerville tavern. It weren't a proper fence like for livestock, more like a warning, made of branches all twisted together with bits of metal and glass worked into it so it caught the sun. Strangest thing was the tiny bells hung at intervals. Not cowbells, mind you, but small brass bells like you find on a lady's adornment. Made an unnatural tinkling when the wind blew. No gate that I could see. Must have pulled it apart and rebuilt it whenever he came or went. The winter of 1863-1864 was particularly harsh in the Sierra foothills. Heavy snows isolated many of the mining communities for weeks at a time. Caldwell, according to all available records, did not come to town for nearly 3 months. When he finally appeared at Perkins's store in late February, witnesses described him as looking gaunt and weathered beyond his years. He purchased double his usual supplies and, for the first time since his arrival in the area, a bottle of whiskey. The store ledger also records the purchase of 3 heavy padlocks. An entry in the personal diary of Sarah Jenkins, wife of a local minister, provides a rare glimpse of Caldwell during this period. Her husband had organized a community relief effort following a particularly severe snowstorm, and she accompanied him in distributing provisions to outlying homesteads. "We approached the Caldwell place with some trepidation," she wrote, as Mr. Jenkins had heard disquieting rumors about the occupant. The snow had drifted nearly to the roof on the northern side, but a path had been meticulously cleared around the entire structure. We called out, but received no answer, though smoke rose from the chimney. As we were about to depart, the door opened slightly, and a thin hand extended, holding a gold coin. A hoarse voice instructed us to leave any spare coffee on the stump and take the coin in exchange. We never saw the man's face, but the hand that held the coin had peculiar dark stains beneath the fingernails like dried ink. Throughout the spring and summer of 1864, Caldwell's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He began making trips to town at irregular intervals, sometimes appearing twice in a week, other times vanishing for a month or more. His banking activities also changed. Instead of making deposits, he began withdrawing significant amounts of his savings. The bank manager, Robert Holloway, noted in his personal journal that Caldwell appeared nervous to the point of paranoia, and once startled violently when another patron entered the bank, knocking over his hat to reveal a patch of scalp entirely devoid of hair, as though torn out. Holloway, whose journal provides some of the most detailed contemporary observations of Caldwell, recorded another disturbing incident in June 1864. Caldwell came to the bank today in an agitated state, demanding to access his safety deposit box at an hour after we had closed. When I explained the vault was locked until morning, he became uncommonly insistent, claiming he needed to add something to the box immediately. His manner was so disturbing that I summoned Wilkes, the bank guard, to stand nearby. Caldwell noticed this precaution and immediately composed himself, apologizing for his unseemly urgency. What troubled me most was not his initial agitation, but how quickly he could adopt a veneer of normalcy. Before leaving, he asked me a most peculiar question, whether I believed a man's possessions retained some essence of him after death. I made some non-committal reply, and he nodded as though I had confirmed something significant. The contents of Caldwell's safety deposit box would not be examined until 1865, after his disappearance. Bank records indicate it contained only a sealed envelope addressed to the finder, which was turned over to Marshall Hooker but subsequently disappeared from the official record. According to testimony given decades later by Hooker's deputy, Nathan Reynolds, the envelope contained a hand-drawn map of Caldwell's property with certain areas marked with small crosses and a cryptic message: "What is buried gives no peace. What is kept brings no comfort." In September 1864, a Mexican trader named Miguel Vega reported a strange encounter with Caldwell on the road to Placerville. According to Vega's account, given to Marshall Hooker the following day, he had passed Caldwell walking toward town before sunrise. The American was talking to himself, very intense, like arguing. When he saw me, he became silent and put his hand inside his coat. I rode past quickly. But strangest was that when I looked back, he was standing in the middle of the road, watching me, not moving at all. Vega's account gained significance when considered alongside a series of disappearances reported during the late summer and early fall of 1864. 3 separate travelers, a mail carrier, a supply wagon driver, and a young man heading east to visit family, vanished while traversing the section of road that passed near Caldwell's property. In each case, searches were conducted but yielded no results. The prevailing theory at the time attributed these disappearances to bandit activity, which had increased as the profitability of the gold fields declined and desperate men turned to robbery. By late autumn, rumors about Caldwell had begun to circulate through Placerville and the surrounding settlements. Some suggested he had found an extraordinary gold deposit and had gone mad trying to protect it. Others intimated darker possibilities, that he was a fugitive from justice in the East, or that he practiced strange rituals in the isolation of his cabin. What no one suspected, according to all available records, was the truth that would not be discovered for another century. A piece of correspondence that surfaced in the archives of the Wells Fargo office in Sacramento sheds light on the growing suspicions surrounding Caldwell. The letter, dated November 18, 1864, was from the Placerville branch manager to his superior. Regarding your inquiry about unusual activity in the Placerville to Coloma corridor, I should mention the increasing concern about a solitary miner named Caldwell. While no evidence exists connecting him to any wrongdoing, the timing of his movements often coincides with reported disappearances. Marshall Hooker has been alerted, but indicates that suspicion alone provides insufficient cause for a thorough investigation. I have instructed our stage drivers to maintain heightened vigilance when passing near the Caldwell property, particularly after dark. On December 12, 1864, Thomas Caldwell made his final recorded appearance in Placerville. He visited the bank first, withdrawing almost all of his remaining funds. Holloway's journal describes him as wild-eyed and unkempt, with hands bearing fresh abrasions, as though he had been digging frantically in rocky soil. From the bank, Caldwell went to Perkins's store, where he purchased an unusual combination of items: 50 pounds of salt, 3 additional padlocks, 20 yards of heavy canvas, and a case of candles. He paid in gold dust rather than coin, which Perkins noted was mixed with an unusual quantity of black sand, as though hastily gathered. The clerk at Perkins' store that day, a young man named Edwin Fletcher, later provided additional details about Caldwell's final visit. What stuck with me wasn't just what he bought, but how he kept looking over his shoulder, like he expected someone to be following him. When I was packing his supplies, he leaned across the counter and asked if I'd heard any stories about lights moving on their own in the hills at night. Before I could answer, he shook his head and said, "They follow now. They know what's theirs." I assumed he'd been drinking, though he didn't smell of liquor. After completing his purchases, Caldwell was seen heading east out of town, walking rather than riding, despite having purchased supplies that would have been difficult to carry such a distance. This was the last confirmed sighting of Thomas Caldwell. 2 travelers reported passing a man matching Caldwell's description later that same day, approximately 5 miles east of Placerville. Andrew Davis and his brother-in-law Thomas Kent provided statements to Marshall Hooker, indicating they had seen a man struggling with several large bundles on the mountain road. Kent's statement noted, "The man seemed in great distress, not physical but mental. He was muttering to himself and repeatedly looking back down the road, though we saw no one following him. When we offered assistance, he became almost violent in his refusal, shouting that we should keep away from what isn't ours by right. He had a wild look about him, and his clothes were stained with what might have been clay or mud." When he failed to appear in town for several months, few people took notice at first. The transient nature of mining communities meant that men frequently moved on to new prospects without announcement. It was only in the spring of 1865, when Marshall Hooker was pursuing a group of bandits who had robbed the Placerville stagecoach, that anyone approached Caldwell's cabin. What Hooker found, according to his official report filed on April 17, 1865, was an abandoned property with the door secured by multiple padlocks. Believing the cabin might be used as a hideout by the bandits, Hooker broke the locks and entered. His report describes the interior as in a state of peculiar order, not consistent with hasty abandonment. The bed was made, dishes were clean and stored, and Caldwell's mining equipment was arranged neatly against one wall. The only sign of disturbance was a trapdoor in the floor that stood open, revealing a ladder descending into darkness. Hooker's report becomes remarkably vague at this point, stating only that he inspected the cellar and found no persons hiding therein. He secured the property and continued his pursuit of the bandits. No further official investigation of Caldwell's disappearance was ever conducted. His property eventually escated to the county for unpaid taxes and was left to deteriorate over the decades that followed. What Hooker's official report omitted became the subject of local rumor for years afterward. According to an account given by Ezekiel Turner, one of the deputies who accompanied Hooker that day, the marshal descended into the cellar alone and remained below for nearly 20 minutes. When he emerged, according to Turner, his face had gone the color of ash, and he ordered us out of the cabin immediately. On the ride back to town, he spoke not a word. That evening I observed him burning his clothing behind the jailhouse. When questioned, he claimed they had become contaminated with poison oak, but I saw no evidence of the rash that typically accompanies such exposure. The case might have remained nothing more than a frontier footnote, if not for the highway survey team that arrived in the summer of 1964. Led by civil engineer Warren Phillips, the team was mapping the proposed route for an expansion of Highway 50 when they came across the remains of Caldwell's cabin, by then little more than a stone chimney, and the outline of a foundation partially reclaimed by the forest. Standard procedure required documentation of any structures that would be affected by the highway project. Phillips and his assistant, Raymond Mercer, began measuring and photographing the ruins. It was Mercer who noticed that the ground inside the foundation seemed to sound different when walked upon. Using basic tools, the men uncovered what remained of Caldwell's cellar entrance. The discovery was made on June 28, 1964, during an unusually hot spell. Phillips's personal notes, later donated to the El Dorado County Historical Society, described the excavation. Despite nearly a century of exposure to the elements, the trapdoor framework remains remarkably intact, protected by the collapsed roof that had fallen directly atop it. The wood shows signs of deliberate preservation, possibly treatment with creosote or a similar substance. Most striking is the elaborate locking mechanism. Not one but 3 separate iron hasps, each designed to hold a padlock. The craftsmanship is inconsistent with typical mining camp construction, suggesting Caldwell possessed skills beyond those of an average prospector. What they found beneath has become the subject of considerable debate among historians and criminologists. The official report filed with the California Department of Transportation and later sealed by court order until 1992 describes a space approximately 15 feet square that had been excavated beneath the cabin's foundation. The walls had been reinforced with timber stolen from the nearby Cosumnes River Bridge, according to matching wood grain patterns later identified by forensic analysts. The cellar contained no gold or valuable minerals, as local legend might have suggested. Instead, it held an elaborate arrangement of small chambers constructed from stone and mortar, each secured with heavy iron hasps that once held the padlocks Caldwell had purchased. Phillips's report describes these chambers as cell-like in appearance, though too small for human occupancy. The largest measured only 4 feet long by 2 feet wide. Dr. Eleanor Simmons, a forensic archaeologist who examined the site in 1966 after the initial discovery had been reported to state authorities, provided a more detailed analysis. The chambers appear designed specifically for storage rather than confinement. Each was lined with canvas treated with a salt solution, consistent with primitive preservation techniques of the 19th century. The floors were layered with charcoal and dried pine needles, materials known to absorb moisture and odor. Most tellingly, each chamber contained small drainage channels carved into the stone, leading to a central collection point where a ceramic vessel had once stood. The entire arrangement suggests knowledge of preservation techniques typically associated with mortuary practices of the period, though adapted for a purpose I hesitate to speculate upon in an official capacity. Inside these chambers, the survey team discovered hundreds of personal effects: pocket watches, wedding rings, eyeglasses, dentures, boots, spectacles, combs, belt buckles, and various other items that would have been carried by travelers during the gold rush era. Each item had been wrapped carefully in canvas and labeled with dates spanning from 1855 to 1864. None of the items appeared to be particularly valuable in monetary terms. These were not treasures, but personal possessions. Mercer later recounted finding one chamber that contained nothing but hair, dozens of small canvas pouches filled with human hair of varying colors and lengths, each meticulously labeled with a date and what appeared to be measurements. Another chamber held only buttons, organized by material, bone, shell, metal, and cloth, again with precise dates attached to each grouping. The organizational system spoke of a mind both methodical and disturbed. Most disturbing was the discovery of a leather-bound journal, largely deteriorated but with portions still legible, found secured in a tin box beneath one of the stone chambers. The journal, presumed to be Caldwell's, contained entries that have been described by the few officials who reviewed it as the methodical recordings of a deeply disturbed mind. The journal did not contain confessions to specific crimes, but rather detailed observations about travelers on the roads near Placerville, their appearance, their possessions, and disturbingly, the sounds they would make when startled. Professor Martin Greaves of the University of California, who was permitted to examine portions of the journal for historical research in 1994, described the contents as the dispassionate observations of a predator studying prey. One entry he cited in his subsequent paper read, April 9, 1860. Man approximately 35 years, traveling alone from Sacramento based on mud patterns on boots, carried pocket watch with inscription suggesting family waiting, approached from downwind as recommended. Subject exhibited standard startle response followed by brief defensive posture. Collection process completed in under 4 minutes. Unusual comportment throughout. Subject maintained eye contact well past expected duration. Pocket watch added to western chamber with others of its kind. Geological evidence suggests that Caldwell had been operating a moderately productive gold mining operation as a cover for his other activities. Analysis of soil samples from the property indicates that he had indeed found a workable vein of gold-bearing quartz, which explained his regular bank deposits and apparent financial stability. What the gold mining did not explain was the collection of personal items meticulously cataloged and stored beneath his cabin floor. The technological limitations of 1964 prevented investigators from conducting the kind of forensic analysis that might be possible today. However, chemist Dr. Harold Werner, who analyzed soil and material samples from the chambers, reported finding traces of unusual compounds. His analysis, included as an appendix to the sealed report, noted, residue from the canvas wrappings contains a mixture of sodium chloride, common salt, potassium nitrate, saltpeter, and trace amounts of mercuric chloride, a combination consistent with preservation techniques used for organic materials in the 19th century. Such compounds were typically employed by medical schools and museums to preserve anatomical specimens. The quantity of these chemicals found at the site suggests Caldwell had knowledge and resources beyond those of an ordinary miner. After the 1964 discovery, authorities conducted a thorough search of the surrounding area using what were then modern archaeological techniques. Approximately 200 yards from the cabin site, in a densely wooded ravine, they discovered a series of depressions in the earth that experts determined were unmarked graves. Due to the passage of time and environmental factors, no remains were recovered sufficient for identification. However, soil analysis revealed traces of the same salt Caldwell had purchased in unusually large quantities. Forensic geologist Amanda Reeves, who participated in the 1964 excavation, noted in her field journal, made public in a 2005 retrospective publication, that the arrangement of the burial site suggested planning rather than convenience. The depressions are arrayed in a roughly circular pattern around a central point marked by a large boulder. The boulder itself bears no visible markings, but has been positioned deliberately, as it is not native to the immediate area, but appears to have been transported from the riverbed below. Each depression is approximately the same size and depth, suggesting a standardized approach. The entire arrangement gives the disturbing impression of ritual rather than mere disposal. The case was never officially resolved. With no surviving witnesses and the principal suspect long dead himself, county records suggest Caldwell most likely perished in the harsh winter of 1865-1866. The investigation was eventually closed. The highway project was rerouted slightly to avoid disturbing the site, which was subsequently covered and unmarked at the request of local officials concerned about macabre tourism. What makes the Caldwell case so unsettling is not just the evidence of what appears to have been a series of methodical attacks on travelers in the gold country, but the complete absence of any suspicious behavior that might have alerted his contemporaries. In an era of frontier justice where minor infractions could result in hanging, Caldwell operated for nearly a decade without raising sufficient alarm to warrant investigation. His isolation, once seen as mere eccentricity, appears in retrospect to have been a calculated strategy. A comparative study conducted in 1979 by criminologist Dr. Rebecca Mitchell attempted to place Caldwell's activities in historical context. Her research identified several similar cases from the same era, including that of the Bender family in Kansas, who operated a wayside inn where they murdered and robbed travelers in the early 1870s. Mitchell noted key differences, however. Unlike the Benders and similar predators who killed primarily for financial gain, Caldwell's behavior suggests different motivations. The careful preservation and cataloging of personal items, many of minimal monetary value, indicates a psychological compulsion rather than material greed. The organizational system he employed, sorting by type rather than by victim, suggests he viewed his activities through a disturbingly clinical lens, perhaps seeing himself as a collector rather than a killer. Perhaps most disturbing is the entry found on the final legible page of Caldwell's journal, dated December 10, 1864, just 2 days before his last appearance in Placerville. The entry, partially reconstructed by document specialists from the California State Archives, reads, "The ground speaks to me now. Every night its voice grows stronger. It knows what I have given it and what I have kept. Soon I must decide whether to silence it forever or to join my collection beneath." This final entry has been interpreted various ways by experts who have studied the case. Forensic psychiatrist Dr. Lawrence Kelso suggested in a 1996 analysis that it indicates Caldwell was experiencing auditory hallucinations, possibly as a result of mercury poisoning, a common affliction among gold miners who used quicksilver in their extraction processes. The progressive paranoia, combined with delusions and the physical symptoms reported by witnesses, is consistent with chronic mercury toxicity, Kelso wrote. However, the organized nature of his activities and his ability to maintain a facade of normalcy in town suggests that mental illness alone cannot explain his behavior. Rather, any psychiatric condition likely exacerbated underlying pathological tendencies. In 1968, a retired marshal named Edward Hooker, grandson of James Hooker, who had investigated the cabin in 1865, came forward with a family document that cast new light on the case. The document, a personal letter from James Hooker to his wife, contradicted his official report about finding nothing unusual in Caldwell's cellar. In the letter, James Hooker wrote, "I cannot bring myself to file an official account of what I observed beneath that man's floor. To do so would be to admit that such darkness exists in men's souls, and I find I haven't the constitution for it. I have secured the door as best I could, and will say nothing more of it. Some evils are best left buried." The letter continues with details absent from the official record. The space below was not merely a root cellar, as I suggested to the men, but a chamber of horrors such as I never imagined could exist. The walls were lined with small compartments, each secured with a lock, and each containing objects I can only describe as trophies. In one open compartment I observed personal effects wrapped carefully in cloth, a pocket watch, a wedding band, a pair of spectacles, items that reminded me of possessions carried by the young man from Ohio reported missing last autumn. Most disturbing was a small notebook filled with precise measurements and observations, the nature of which decency forbids me from describing to you, my dear. I have instructed the men to avoid the property entirely, claiming concern about structural instability. The letter suggests that the original investigation was deliberately curtailed, perhaps due to the disturbing nature of what was found, or possibly to avoid causing panic in a community already characterized by transience and uncertainty. Whatever the reason for the official silence, it allowed the full truth of Thomas Caldwell's activities to remain hidden for another century. In the decades following the 1964 discovery, several attempts have been made to connect Caldwell to unsolved disappearances during the Gold Rush era. Passenger manifests and stagecoach records from 1855 to 1864 showed dozens of travelers who arrived in San Francisco or Sacramento bound for the gold fields but never returned or contacted relatives. However, such disappearances were common in the chaotic gold rush period, as men often abandoned their former identities or fell victim to the harsh conditions of frontier mining. Definitively linking any specific disappearance to Caldwell has proven impossible. Historian Margaret Barnes, whose 1987 book, Shadow on the Sierra, remains the most comprehensive examination of the case, identified 17 individuals whose disappearances coincided with Caldwell's presence in the area and whose descriptions of personal effects matched items found in the underground chambers. The evidence, while circumstantial, is compelling, Barnes wrote. In each case, the missing person was last seen on the road passing near Caldwell's property, was traveling alone or had become separated from companions, and possessed items similar to those cataloged in the chambers. Most tellingly, the dates recorded on the wrapped possessions frequently align with reported disappearances. What researchers have been able to establish with some certainty is that prior to his arrival in California, Thomas Caldwell did not exist. No record of a man by that name matching his approximate age and description has been found in any eastern state. The gold coins he used to establish himself in Placerville were minted in Philadelphia between 1847 and 1852, suggesting he may have come west with capital acquired elsewhere. One theory proposed by criminologists is that Caldwell fled the eastern United States after committing similar crimes, though no matching cases have been identified. A tantalizing clue emerged in 1991 when a researcher examining newspapers from Philadelphia discovered a series of articles from 1853 describing the disappearance of a medical student named Thomas Merrill, who vanished after being accused of stealing anatomical specimens and preservation chemicals from the university where he studied. The physical description of Merrill bears some resemblance to what is known of Caldwell, and the timing of his disappearance coincides with Caldwell's emergence in California 2 years later. However, no definitive connection has been established. The landscape around the former Caldwell property has changed dramatically since the 1860s. The dense forests that once provided isolation have been thinned by logging and development. The small tributary where he presumably panned for gold now runs intermittently, affected by decades of mining operations upstream. Highway 50, though rerouted from the original survey, passes within a mile of the site. Thousands of travelers pass by daily, unaware of the dark history buried in those hills. Local resident Martin Schaefer, whose family has owned land in the vicinity since the 1890s, reported in an oral history collection compiled by the El Dorado County Library that stories about the Caldwell property persisted for generations. My grandfather used to warn us children never to play near the old chimney in the woods. He said the ground there was sour and nothing good would come of disturbing it. For years, locals avoided the area completely. Even deer hunters would walk around rather than through that particular hollow. There was no rational explanation for it, just an understanding passed down that some places are better left alone. The few surviving artifacts recovered from Caldwell's cellar are now stored in a secure facility maintained by the California State University system. Access is restricted to authorized researchers, and detailed photographs of the collection have never been publicly released. According to those who have examined them, many of the items show signs of having been carefully cleaned and preserved by Caldwell, suggesting they held some significance beyond mere trophies. Dr. Catherine Mitchell, curator of historical artifacts at the university, provided a rare description of the collection in a scholarly article published in 2002. The preservation techniques employed were sophisticated for the period, indicating knowledge of methods typically restricted to medical professionals or museum curators. Each item was wrapped in canvas treated with preservative compounds, then sealed with wax. Labels affixed to each package contain not just dates, but precise locations, times, and in some cases, cryptic notations that appear to record emotional states: resigned, disbelieving, combative. The overall impression is of a systematic documentation process rather than the impulsive collection of souvenirs. The most enduring question in the Caldwell case is not what happened. The evidence strongly suggests he was responsible for the disappearance of numerous travelers through the gold country, but why he abruptly abandoned his cabin in December 1864, leaving behind his meticulously maintained collection. The answer may lie in his final journal entry with its reference to the ground speaking. Some researchers have suggested he began suffering from acute paranoia, perhaps triggered by the guilt of his actions. Others speculate that he feared imminent discovery, possibly due to the increasing attention for Marshall Hooker. A geological survey conducted in 1972 offers another possibility. The report notes that the winter of 1865 saw unusually heavy rainfall in the Sierra foothills, causing significant erosion in many areas. One particularly severe storm on December 11, 1864, the day before Caldwell's final appearance in town, caused a series of landslides throughout El Dorado County. It's possible that erosion began to expose some of what Caldwell had buried on his property, necessitating his hasty purchase of additional supplies to resecure his grim secrets. Meteorological records from Sacramento confirm that the winter of 1864-1865 was indeed exceptionally wet. The December 11th storm dumped nearly 7 inches of rain in a 24-hour period, causing widespread flooding throughout the region. A newspaper account published in the Sacramento Daily Union described hillsides giving way like snow in spring thaw, and old mining pits revealed where earth had slipped away. For someone like Caldwell, whose security depended on keeping his activities buried, such conditions would have presented an existential crisis. Local folklore collector Eliza Montgomery documented a story told by Daniel Harper, an elderly resident of Placerville, in 1952. According to Harper, whose father had been a member of a search party organized after the disappearances of 1864, there was talk of strange findings on the hillside near Caldwell's property following the December storm. Pa would never speak directly of what they found where the earth had slid, Harper reportedly told Montgomery. He would only say they decided as a group to cover it back up and tell no one, as some things weren't meant for decent folks to see. After that, whenever the subject of Caldwell came up, Pa would leave the room. Whatever prompted his disappearance, it seems clear that Thomas Caldwell never intended to abandon his collection permanently. The care with which he had secured the cabin, multiple padlocks on both the outer door and the cellar entrance, suggests he planned to return. The fact that he withdrew his savings rather than abandoning them indicates he was fleeing rather than having met with foul play on his property. A theory proposed by investigative journalist William Evans in his 1980 book, Dark Harvest: Untold Stories of the California Gold Rush, suggests that Caldwell may have been creating a secondary location. Evans cited an 1865 land purchase record from Calaveras County, approximately 50 miles south of Placerville, for a remote parcel bought by a T. Caldwin, a name similar enough to raise suspicion. The timing of the purchase just weeks after Caldwell's disappearance from Placerville, and the similarity of the property, isolated, overlooking a travel route, supports the theory that he may have been attempting to relocate his operation. The most likely explanation, according to historians familiar with the case, is that Caldwell fell victim to the same harsh wilderness that had allowed him to operate undetected for so long. The winter of 1864-1865 was one of the most severe on record in the Sierra Nevada. If Caldwell was attempting to establish a new location or perhaps transport portions of his collection to another site, he may have succumbed to exposure, accident, or animal attack. Without a clear trail or timeline of his movements after December 12th, we can only speculate. A report filed by a hunting party in February 1865 describes the discovery of abandoned supplies approximately 12 miles northeast of Placerville in the direction of the high country. The report, stored in the county sheriff's records, notes finding a bundle containing canvas, rope, and preserved foodstuffs, apparently abandoned in haste, beside a creek swollen by winter rains. While the supplies were not definitively linked to Caldwell, the location and timing are consistent with his flight from the area. Further supporting the theory that Caldwell met his end in the wilderness is the account of a Washoe tribal member recorded by an ethnographer in 1901. The account describes finding the remains of a white man in the high country east of Placerville sometime around 1866. According to the translated narrative, we found him in the place of tall pines where two streams meet. He had died long before, perhaps in the season of deep snow. Animals had scattered his bones, but nearby was a satchel containing many small packages wrapped in cloth. Our elder said to leave everything as we found it, as the man's spirit seemed troubled. We placed stones over the bones and spoke words to calm angry ghosts. In a final unsettling coda to the story, the Highway Survey team that made the 1964 discovery reported an unexplained phenomenon during their excavation of the cellar. According to statements made by Raymond Mercer years later, the team experienced equipment failures and unusual accidents throughout the 3 days they worked at the site. Most notably, their photographs of the interior chambers initially failed to develop properly, showing only black exposures despite proper camera settings. When they attempted to return to the site for additional documentation, they found the cellar entrance had collapsed overnight, though there had been no rain or seismic activity reported in the area. Mercer's account, recorded in an oral history project conducted by the University of California in 1988, included details omitted from the official reports. The whole time we were working that site, there was a feeling of wrongness about it. Tools would go missing, only to turn up in places we'd already searched. Several of the men reported hearing footsteps in the woods when no one was there. I'm a rational man, not given to superstition, but there was something about that place that affected all of us. Phillips, the lead engineer, had a particularly unnerving experience. He was alone in the cellar making measurements when he distinctly heard someone whispering his name from one of the empty chambers. He was so disturbed by it that he refused to return to the site the next day. Warren Phillips, the lead engineer, refused to discuss the Caldwell site in any detail for the remainder of his career. In his only public statement about the discovery, made shortly before his retirement in 1982, he said simply, "There are some places where the land itself seems to absorb the evil that men do. The Caldwell site is such a place. I've never felt right about what we disturbed there." The official explanation for abandoning further excavation cited structural concerns after the partial collapse. However, internal memoranda obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests in the 1990s suggest other factors may have influenced the decision. A letter from the project supervisor to the Department of Transportation headquarters referenced unusual circumstances and staff concerns that made continuing work at the site inadvisable from a personnel welfare perspective. The letter requested reassignment of the survey team to different sections of the highway project and recommended that the proposed route be altered to avoid the area entirely, despite the additional cost such changes would incur. The psychological impact on those involved in uncovering Caldwell's secrets extended beyond the survey team. Dr. Harold Werner, the chemist who analyzed materials from the site, took a leave of absence shortly after submitting his findings and eventually resigned from his position with the state laboratory. His colleague, Dr. Marion Lewis, later revealed in a private correspondence that Werner had been troubled by nightmares following his work on the Caldwell evidence. "He told me he could smell the chemicals from the samples even when he was at home," Lewis wrote. "He became convinced that handling the materials had somehow contaminated him, though all safety protocols had been followed. In his final weeks at the lab, he refused to enter the storage room where the Caldwell samples were kept. The area where Thomas Caldwell once lived, and presumably buried more than gold, is now unremarkable forest land, indistinguishable from the surrounding hillsides. No marker indicates the historical significance of the site." The exact coordinates were deliberately omitted from official records to prevent curiosity seekers from disturbing what many involved in the case came to consider hallowed ground. Author and historian James Thornton, who has written extensively on California's gold rush history, visited the approximate location in 2005 while researching a book on forgotten crimes of the era. His description captures the ordinary appearance that belies the site's dark history. Standing among the pine and cedar trees on the hillside, with Highway 50 audible but not visible in the distance, there is nothing to suggest the horror that once unfolded here. The stone chimney has long since collapsed, its stones scattered or repurposed by later inhabitants of the area. The depression that once marked the cabin's foundation has filled with decades of fallen needles and leaves. Nature has reclaimed its own, erasing the physical evidence of one man's disturbing obsession. Yet something lingers in the atmosphere, a stillness that feels watchful rather than peaceful. Perhaps it's fitting that the full truth of what occurred in that small cabin east of Placerville remains partially buried, like the secrets Caldwell himself tried to conceal. The gold rush era was a time of reinvention and opportunity, but also of lawlessness and anonymity. In the chaos of a society forming itself from disparate individuals all seeking fortune, a man like Caldwell could operate undetected, burying his victims and their possessions in the same earth from which others sought gold. The paradox of the Caldwell case is that his apparent success as a miner, the very activity that brought thousands of men to California, served as the perfect cover for his other, darker pursuits. Gold mining by its nature was solitary, exhausting work that often kept men isolated for long periods. A prospector who preferred solitude raised few eyebrows in a community where many came specifically to escape social constraints. Caldwell's cabin, positioned away from the main settlements, but near enough to access travelers on the mountain roads, provided the ideal vantage point for someone with predatory intentions. Psychological profilers who have studied the case suggest that Caldwell represents an unusual category of killer, one who appears to have been motivated primarily by collection rather than the act of killing itself. Dr. Emily Richardson, a forensic psychologist who analyzed the available evidence for a 2008 paper in the Journal of Historical Criminology, concluded, "The methodical organization, careful preservation, and cataloging of possessions rather than remains suggests a perpetrator who assigned special significance to the objects associated with his victims. The sorting by type rather than by individual further indicates that Caldwell was creating what he perceived as a meaningful taxonomy, a collection with internal logic rather than merely accumulating trophies of violence. What we know with certainty is that something terrible happened along that quiet tributary of the American River. The evidence speaks clearly across more than a century. Methodical chambers built to house personal possessions, carefully wrapped and labeled, unmarked graves containing traces of preserving salt, a journal documenting observations of potential victims, and the inexplicable final flight of a man who had created a life dedicated to death. A final piece of the Caldwell puzzle emerged in 2010 when renovations to the old El Dorado County Courthouse uncovered a forgotten evidence lockbox containing items removed from Caldwell's safety deposit box in 1865. Among the contents was a daguerreotype photograph, a self-portrait presumably taken before his arrival in California. The image shows a thin-faced man of indeterminate middle age, dressed in the formal style of the early 1850s. What makes the image remarkable is not the subject's appearance, which is unremarkable, but what the photograph reveals in the background: shelves lined with small wrapped packages identical in style to those later found in the underground chambers of his California cabin. The implication is clear. Caldwell's activities in Placerville were not an aberration, but a continuation of behavior established elsewhere. The photograph has renewed interest in identifying who Thomas Caldwell really was before he appeared in California, though to date no definitive match has been made with any known individual from eastern states during that period. The California Gold Rush created countless stories of ambition, struggle, triumph, and failure. But few are as dark as the story of the miner who buried more than gold, a man who, in seeking isolation, created a chamber of horrors beneath the very ground from which others sought fortune. His legacy remains not in the gold he mined, but in the questions that echo through time about how many travelers journeyed hopefully toward new lives only to disappear into the earth of Caldwell's hillside claim, their possessions cataloged and preserved by hands that had ended their dreams of gold and glory. And perhaps on certain nights when the wind moves through the pines along that hillside, one might imagine the ground itself speaking, telling secrets of what lies buried beneath the silent California soil. For as Thomas Caldwell discovered in his final days, what is buried does not always remain silent, and the earth eventually reveals what has been hidden in its depths.